"Get off my land!" She screamed from my porch, treating me like an intruder in the very cabin my father had built. At first I thought she was joking, a clipboard clenched like a weapon, a violation notice in her other hand, until I realized she was entirely serious, insisting the property belonged to her. She waved papers as if the lake itself hinged on them. It felt unreal, like waking up inside someone else's nightmare. "Tell me, would you have laughed or lost it?" Moving back into the old family cabin felt like stepping into a half-forgotten memory. The house sat about 50 feet from the water, a wooden porch overlooking the cove where my dad used to fish every morning. I'd inherited it 6 months earlier but only now had time to settle in. The boards underfoot creaked as I hauled boxes from my truck, and it was oddly comforting to be somewhere that made sense again. The pines smelled the same, the sharp mix of sap and lake air that punches straight through your chest with nostalgia. Dad's toolbox sat where he always left it, on the porch steps. Inside were his property markers, the ones he used to stake boundary lines when neighbors still minded their fences. My eye caught the rusty steel anchor ring bolted into the dock, probably installed when Dad first bought the place in the 1960s, weathered to a patina only decades of lakeside life can create, yet still rock solid. I was wiping down the handrail, soaking in the quiet, when I heard quick, determined footsteps through the grass. The voice that followed cut across the morning like a saw. I turned and saw a woman in her late 40s, blonde hair pulled back so tight it looked painful, dressed in a hostile jogging outfit, clipboard in one hand, a paper thrust forward in the other like it was a decree. "You need to get off my land immediately. This is community lakefront property under home management and you're violating our aesthetic standards." She jabbed the notice toward me. It mentioned a $75 fine. I stared at the document, then at her, and felt the sheer absurdity. Our family had owned that land long before she was born, and now she was treating me like a trespasser. "There must be some mistake," I said. "This is my family's cabin, it's been ours for over 40 years. I motioned to the weathered house behind me, the kind of wear that only decades of lakeside weather can give. She shook her head as if I spoke a foreign tongue. "Number: all lakefront property within community sightlines falls under HOA jurisdiction for aesthetic compliance," she said, structure like it was something stuck to her shoe. By that logic she could regulate anything visible from her development, half the lake, half the county. The entitlement was breathtaking, the conviction behind it even more so. I picked up the utility welcome letter that had been left on the porch railing and pointed to the section clearly showing my address lay outside HOA jurisdiction. She barely glanced at it and dismissed it with a wave. "Administrative oversight. We're correcting boundary issues with the county," she said, inventing policy as she spoke with impressive confidence. A wind chime clanged across the cove, and something about that sound made me look toward the HOA side of the lake. The chime came from their dock, the metallic ring carried perfectly across the water. Strange that I'd never noticed it before, maybe because I'd never had someone claiming ownership of my shoreline while standing on my porch. The timing felt like cosmic background music for a surreal debate about property and manufactured authority. "Wait, you're telling me the land in front of my porch belongs to you, and you'll fine me $75 for being here?" I said aloud, partly to myself. Her face flushed. She pointed at the lake. "Community water access rights supersede individual property claims. We maintain these standards for everyone's benefit." She was effectively claiming the water itself and the county-managed lake is within her domain. I pulled out my phone and started recording. Honestly, who would believe this otherwise? The morning light made a perfect shot, showing her expression and the clear divide between my property and the HOA development across the cove. She straightened, convinced that the camera lent her authority. "The HOA has environmental oversight responsibilities that extend to all waterfront properties affecting community aesthetics," she declared, doubling down and inventing responsibilities on the spot. The wind chime clanged again from the HOA side, right next to a bright orange "No Trespassing" sign by their dock. The irony stung. She claimed authority over my water access while her community restricted access to the very water they purportedly managed for everyone's good. I looked at the rusty anchor ring on my dock there long before anyone from the HOA existed, and something clicked. This wasn't about appearances or environmental care, it was about control. How far would she push this overreach, and how much trouble would it cause if I refused to simply pay the fine and move on? 3 days after that performance on my porch, I woke to find a yellow plastic barrier stretched across my lake access route, anchored to my own steel ring. It was the kind of silt curtain contractors use for water projects, but there was no work happening. Bright plastic, blocking my path to the water, attached to my property without so much as a courtesy call. I stood in my pajamas, coffee in hand, staring at it. The audacity was jaw-dropping. A small placard, zip-tied to the barrier, read, Temporary Environmental Protection Measure HOA Authorization HV 2407. The date was 2 days earlier. They'd done this while I was at work, sneaking onto my shoreline like kids committing a prank. The installation looked professional. Metal stakes driven into my bank, industrial-grade cables, waterproof signage that probably cost more than a small vacation. This wasn't amateur harassment. It was organized, intentional, and expensive. They installed on my property without permission. I remembered Dad's toolbox. Under old tackle and property surveys I found heavy-duty bolt cutters, the kind that feel satisfying in the hand and promise to cut through whatever needs cutting. Dad had been the sort of man who fixed problems directly, holding the cutters. I could almost hear him. Sometimes you have to clear your own path, son. I didn't hesitate. The barrier was latched to my anchor ring and installed without my consent. I clamped the cutters around the first cable and squeezed. The metal snapped with a ping, and the current tugged the plastic downstream. Watching something that didn't belong on my land start to drift away felt profoundly satisfying. Footsteps on gravel announced someone approaching. A fast, angry, familiar, "What do you think you're doing?" Rebecca's voice carried the same authoritative tone as before, but now edged with panic. She marched up with 2 others, board members. I guessed summoned as witnesses or backup. "I'm removing trespassing equipment from my property," I said, surprised by how steady I felt. The bolt cutters sat in my hands like proof of intention. Rebecca's face shifted through several colors to a flushed red. "You just destroyed community environmental protection equipment," she accused, inventing reasons as she went. "That barrier was preventing erosion runoff from affecting our water quality monitoring." Her 2 companions nodded as if this made perfect sense, though anyone familiar with lakes would see the curtain was positioned to block access, not control erosion. Then she changed tactics. "I'll pay you $200 to move that anchor ring 5 feet toward shore. Everyone wins." She even opened a checkbook right on my dock, like she was buying produce. The casual assumption that any problem could be solved with a check was almost more insulting than the trespass. I set the bolt cutters down where she could see them and kept my voice level. "This is my anchor ring on my property. I don't need your permission or your money." She snapped the checkbook shut and switched hats again. "Anchor ring services our community's fire safety water access. By blocking it, you're endangering lives." Another bold-faced lie, delivered as if freed from some official record. My ring was decades older than their HOA and sat well away from any of their property, but she said it loud for her board to hear and thus established it as HOA narrative. I recorded everything. The barrier floated free now, drifting toward the lake's center where the current would carry it to whoever was responsible for cleanup. Rebecca stood there, clipboard in hand, and I realized this was only the start of a long summer I hadn't bargained for. Peace and quiet by the lake suddenly seemed a lot less likely. I watched her expensive little environmental prop drift away, and I could see her brain already turning, planning the next move. In the sunlight the yellow plastic bobbed downstream like a festive parade float celebrating someone's idea of property rights. "This won't end here," she muttered at last, more to herself than to me. The 2 board members with her shifted uneasily, probably realizing they'd just watched their president bribe someone and invent disasters in the span of a week. I waited until they retreated back toward the HOA development before I let myself really process what had happened. Rebecca had moved from violation notices to trespass to attempted bribery in record time. Each escalation was more desperate and more revealing. This wasn't about aesthetics. It was about setting precedent and proving she could push authority farther than it belonged. So what would she try once money didn't buy cooperation? Looking down at my freed anchor ring, an old feeling returned, pride. Dad always said the simplest solution often wins. Don't overthink things. Don't wait for permission. Clear your own path and let the consequences fall where they may. The lake fell quiet again. Mist on the water, soft lapping against the dock, but something told me that calm wouldn't last. That night the harassment shifted. Not smashed windows or graffiti, nothing police-friendly, but small, buzzing surveillance drones that hovered outside my bedroom windows, launched from the HOA side of the cove. At first I thought they were a new security system until I noticed the pattern. They only appeared when I tried to sleep. By the third night I was afraid. The drones arrived like clockwork at 11 and stayed until dawn, swapping batteries as if on a shift schedule. Worse were the camera LEDs, 8 tiny red pinpricks that glared like a sniper's sight just out of comfortable focus, making your jaw clench and your nerves hum. I found myself grinding my teeth in the dark. I started keeping time logs, noting patterns. The drones would retreat the moment I stepped outside and the red lights would dim. Then 5 minutes after I went back inside they'd return to full intensity. That kind of precision wasn't accidental. Someone was monitoring my comings and goings closely enough to know if I was inside or outside, awake or trying to sleep. This was more than harassment, it was orchestrated sleep deprivation meant to wear me down without crossing obvious legal lines. Dad's toolbox became both companion and inspiration. He'd never been one to call for help if he could fix something himself. So I spent a Saturday scavenging through the old lumber pile behind the cabin and repurposing what I found. Weathered planks, spare cables, some batteries, enough to rig a clumsy streaming rig with a phone mount. Building felt like therapy. Each measured cut and driven screw was a small victory against the creeping helplessness Rebecca was trying to impose. I erected a freestanding frame tall enough to capture the area outside my bedroom windows and aimed a live stream at the sky where the drones circled. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. For the first night with the setup running, the drones still buzzed, but they couldn't hide from viewers. The high-pitched whine shrank to background noise and, for the first time in days, I slept through the night. I'd almost felt grateful, absurd, but true, that Rebecca had forced me to rediscover the value of uninterrupted sleep. Of course she couldn't let that stand. The next morning she returned with what looked like the whole HOA board, 6 people in matching polos, tablets in hand, carrying drones as if on an official inspection. She marched straight up to my porch and, before she was even close enough to speak normally, announced to the neighborhood that I was broadcasting unauthorized surveillance feeds that endanger everyone around this lake. She called my lighting system part of our comprehensive security program and claimed my obstruction posed a public safety hazard. Her crew took photos and notes, staging the moment like a production. I rose slowly and walked to the porch edge. Community safety doesn't mean harassing people beyond your community with blinding lights, I said loudly, and a few neighbors came out to see what the commotion was about. Rebecca wanted an audience. She was getting one. Her claim that my blackout was preventing first responders from locating people in distress was another convenient fabrication, but she was creating a paper trail of official sounding lines that could be used later to justify more aggressive action. Then someone I didn't expect spoke up. Mrs. Henderson, 3 houses down, called out that her grandkids had been kept awake by lights aimed toward my place and asked why the safety lights only ever seemed to target my cabin. Her question hung in the air and, for the first time since this started, Rebecca's swagger wobbled. The board shuffled, defensive for the first time. I felt something swell in me I hadn't felt in weeks. Support. Neighbors I hadn't known I could rely on stepped forward. Mr. Garcia across the cove took photos of the targeted lights, and others nodded. Rebecca suddenly looked outnumbered, but she wasn't done. As the crowd dispersed and Sunday routines resumed, I watched her face carefully. She wasn't humiliated, she was calculating. Public confrontation hadn't gone as planned, sure, but she was already planning a different approach, something bigger than neighborhood theatrics. Then Hank Miller arrived. He showed up the following Monday with coffee and a look that immediately put me on edge. Hank had been my dad's best friend for decades. He'd helped build improvements around the property and knew every boundary stake. He belonged on that porch, but his avoidance of eye contact and the tremor in his small talk told me this wouldn't be a social visit. He sat in Dad's old chair as if he belonged there and, after too many pauses, said he needed to talk about Rebecca. When Hank mentioned escalation, an ugly knot tightened in my stomach. He told me folks were talking that Rebecca had presented county documentation about water access, that the lighting setup and the barrier might interfere with emergency services. Hearing him repeat those lines felt like a stab. Hank wasn't parroting malice, he sounded worried. The betrayal landed hard. This had been Hank's place as much as ours. He'd been at Dad's funeral, helped sort his things, and promised to look after the property. Now he was repeating Rebecca's talking points like they were real. "I helped put that anchor ring in," I said. "You know the lines." But doubt flickered across his face. He'd clearly been influenced, convinced there might be merit to her story. That was the worst part. Rebecca wasn't only trying to take control of the land, she was isolating me, turning friends into questioners and allies into uneasy fence-sitters. The coffee in my hand went cold, but I held it because it calmed the tremor in my voice. This was classic strategy. Turn the association against the outsider who refuses to play by their rules. Hank looked genuinely torn, not hostile, but starting to accept the narrative Rebecca had been culturing. Hank looked uneasy, but he finally spoke. "Rebecca told me you threatened to damage neighborhood property, that you were planning to mess with their safety equipment." Lies, of course, but delivered with enough detail to sound believable. That's when it hit me. Rebecca wasn't just fighting for control over my property anymore, she was isolating me. She was reshaping the narrative so I looked like the unstable neighbor while she played the role of the calm, reasonable leader, and disturbingly, it was working. Even Hank, of all people, was sitting in my father's chair, doubting me. "She also brought up federal fire safety equipment," Hank added, this time with genuine worry. "Luke, if emergency gear really is involved, you can't ignore that. Lives could be at risk." I searched for the right words, trying to explain how Rebecca was fabricating all of it, but I knew the more defensive I sounded, the more credible she would appear in contrast. I walked to the porch railing, staring out at the calm lake. The mist rose quietly from the surface, but nothing felt peaceful anymore. My father's oldest friend was questioning me, neighbors were taking sides, and Rebecca had succeeded in painting me as a danger to community safety. For the first time, I felt truly isolated. Before I realized it, the words slipped out. "What if I'm wrong about my rights?" The regret was instant, but I couldn't take it back. Hank's face softened just for a moment. He looked like the man who used to fish with my dad every Saturday. "Luke, I don't want to see you in over your head. Maybe just call the county, check those fire codes. If you're right, then fine, but if there's something you overlook at a broken bar." He didn't finish, but the meaning was clear. Verify the facts before digging myself in deeper. When Hank left, I stayed on the porch alone, confused in a way I hadn't been since this whole conflict started. Maybe I was being stubborn. Maybe there really were regulations I hadn't considered. The doubt was corrosive, creeping into every thought. But then I remembered Rebecca's cold expression when she offered me money to move my anchor ring. I remembered her calculated smirk when the public confrontation slipped from her control. And those perfectly timed harassment lights. No, Rebecca Walsh wasn't the picture of a responsible leader. She was manipulative, strategic, and far too skilled at psychological games. If anything, she was better at this than I'd ever realized. The real question was, how far was she willing to go to win? I pulled out my phone and found the number for the county fire marshal. If Hank wanted me to check my facts, then I'd do exactly that. Either I was correct about my rights, or I was about to learn some hard truths about federal codes. Either way, I needed official answers and not half-truths from someone already under Rebecca's influence. When the water testing kit arrived on Tuesday, I finally felt like I was taking control again. If Rebecca wanted to play the environmental card, I'd counter with undeniable science. No more vague claims, just hard data. I'd ordered a professional-grade kit, the same type consultants used, so the results would be beyond dispute. I carefully collected samples from multiple points around my dock, following the instructions to the letter. The process was tedious: pH strips, bacterial counts, chemical markers, but I documented everything with photos and timestamps. If Rebecca was going to claim my property was polluting the lake, I'd prove otherwise. When the results came back Thursday, I had to read them 3 times. My water wasn't just saphia, it was cleaner than the lake average. Lower bacterial levels, no chemical runoff, nothing harmful at all. In fact, the readings near the hose own access points downstream looked worse. I sat there holding the papers, realizing I had undeniable proof that Rebecca's environmental concerns were nothing but manufactured evidence. This land had been my father's pride, his legacy, and the tests confirmed it was still part of the solution and not the problem. The suspicion burned hotter. If Rebecca was faking contamination reports to justify control, Dad would have exposed it in a heartbeat. Somehow, since his death, her lies had grown unchecked, and I hadn't been around to stop them. That afternoon, Rebecca showed up again, at this time with a new approach. The arrogance was gone. Instead, she arrived with test results in hand, almost like she wanted to collaborate. She spread her papers across my table, but I saw the inconsistencies immediately. Copy-paste numbers, sloppy mismatches, a fabrication dressed up as science. "This lake is under threat," she declared, her voice carrying. She spun a story about swimming here as a child, about wanting to protect the same waters my father cherished. She even laid out some of Dad's old handwritten monitoring notices, stolen, clearly, probably passed along by Hank, twisted, repurposed to support her narrative. She pushed her claims about outdated septic systems, driveway runoff, erosion risks. Not gloating, just calm and persuasive, like a teacher explaining basic facts. For the first time, I knew without question, Rebecca was forging evidence. "What would it take to prove this?" I asked, meaning every word. If my property was being framed as harmful, I had to expose the truth. Rebecca leaned in, smiling faintly. "A septic upgrade, some erosion control, rain gardens for runoff, not cheap, but manageable." We spent nearly an hour discussing supposed solutions. She knew the contractors, the permits, the regulations. It was easy to see why her neighbors trusted her. She could sound reasonable, even helpful, when she wanted to. I caught myself almost believing her, almost seeing her as an ally. But as she packed up her things, I spotted a folder in her stack, a notebook labeled Phase 2. Inside were forged results, doctored signature as a proof of her ongoing schemes. My gut tightened. Even in this seemingly honest moment, Rebecca was already plotting the next move. I smiled, nodded, and agreed to schedule the inspection she suggested. But as she walked away, I realized she wasn't backing down. She was just playing a longer game. That weekend, I turned my living room into a broadcast studio. I laid out everything in my test results, property surveys, photos of the harassment equipment, recordings of Rebecca's contradictory claims. If my neighbors were going to understand the truth, they needed to see the whole picture, not her carefully staged version. The first viewer to respond was an elderly neighbor who uploaded years of home meeting minutes and financial reports. Her message was clear: "Some of us have concerns about Rebecca's methods." Then a retired engineer joined, sharing photos that proved the harassment lights were targeted directly at my cabin. "This configuration makes no sense for security," he typed. Soon, more neighbors chimed in with their own evidence and stories. One woman showed me a violation notice almost identical to mania, proof Rebecca had tried the same tactics on others outside HOA jurisdiction. Finally, a board member confessed that half the board never even knew about Rebecca's projects until after she pushed them through. She called emergency meetings, exaggerated urgency, and bypassed normal votes. That was her pattern: to skip oversight, act unilaterally, and spin it as community protection. I realized then that Rebecca's greatest weakness was exposure. If the community actually saw how she operated, her authority would unravel. So, I proposed a live community stream, not to attack her personally, but to present facts about property rights, environmental science, and proper decision-making. The idea caught on fast. Within a day, over 40 neighbors, including board members, confirmed they'd attend. For the first time, I felt real momentum. People were ready for honesty. But before the event could happen, the board member called me in a panic. Rebecca had already convened an emergency meeting, spinning our efforts as a dangerous opposition to safety and environmental protection. She was reframing everything into a battle between responsible stewardship and property rights extremism. Once again, she was a step ahead. She always managed to stay one move ahead. Our grassroots organizing had been the right path, but it also forced her to expose more of her game plan. By calling an emergency board meeting, Rebecca gave herself official cover for whatever her so-called Phase 2 was supposed to be. Still, Looking at the livestream chat and seeing neighbors who had spent their weekend documenting her abuse of authority, I realized something had shifted. This fight wasn't just about my land anymore. It had become a battle over how our community would be governed. Would decisions be made openly and democratically, or dictated by one person using emergency powers as an excuse? The board member who had called me earlier sounded uneasy. "Luke, there's more." Rebecca's called this meeting to challenge my position on the board. She says my participation in your documentation efforts shows divided loyalty, and that I can't serve the community's best interests anymore. That's when I knew we were hitting a nerve. Rebecca Walsh wouldn't be trying to purge her own allies if she felt secure. It meant our effort was working. The question now was just how far was she willing to go? And what exactly did her push for expanded enforcement authority mean in practice? The community center was overflowing that Tuesday night, packed tighter than I'd ever seen it. People stood along the walls, filled the aisles. Even teenagers showed up after hearing the buzz from their parents. The energy in the room was alive, like the community finally had something worth fighting for. Rebecca walked in with a small army that looked more like a corporate legal team than neighbors, 5 people in suits, briefcases, and folders laid out as if preparing for trial. She wasn't here for a conversation, she was here to stage a formal hearing. That alone told the room everything about how she viewed community input. The format had been agreed on in advance. I would speak first, presenting my evidence via property rights, procedures, and records. Then Rebecca would have her turn to argue for environmental oversight and safety. Finally, the floor would open for questions and shared experiences. Fair, balanced, and transparent. I started simple: property surveys showing my cabin wasn't under HOA jurisdiction. Utility company records confirming my address. County deeds proving my family had owned the lakefront access for more than 4 decades. Piece by piece, I walked through how Rebecca had claimed powers over land that wasn't hers and how every escalation rested on exaggerated claims about safety or the environment. The water quality reports were tricky. They did show some issues near my property that needed attention, but instead of hiding that, I owned it. I explained what I discovered and the steps I was taking to fix it. Property rights and environmental protection aren't enemies, I told the room, locking eyes with Rebecca. We can safeguard the lake while respecting legal limits and following the proper process. Her presentation that followed was pure theater. She began with sweeping aerial photographs of the lake, reminding everyone of its beauty and importance. Then she shared statistics showing a decline in water quality over the last decade, making a strong case for proactive measures. By the time she shifted to my situation, she framed it as the perfect example of why strong oversight was necessary. Community stewardship requires authority, she declared. Individual rights cannot outweigh our collective duty to preserve shared resources. Heads nodded across the room. She was skilled at twisting real concerns into justification for giving herself more power. But then Rebecca made a critical mistake. She pulled out a document I'd never seen, holding it up like a trump card. This federal environmental emergency declaration grants the HOA temporary authority over all lakefront properties until restoration efforts are complete. The paper looked official, stamped with seals and legal phrasing. My stomach dropped. If it was real, then everything I'd been fighting for was pointless. Federal emergency powers override property rights. The audience reacted to whispers, uneasy glances, but something about the paper looked off, and Rebecca was careful not to let anyone examine it. Acting on instinct, I pulled out my phone and called the county environmental office on speaker. I read the reference number aloud for verification. The room went silent as everyone waited. After a few transfers, the answer came clear and firm. There is no federal environmental emergency declaration for your lake. No record exists. The room erupted in shock. Rebecca's face betrayed panic. She tried to recover, claiming the county records must be delayed, but her voice wavered. A board member stood and asked directly, "Rebecca, did you create that document yourself, or did it come from a federal agency?" The question hung in the air like a trap. Either admit forgery or double down on an obvious lie. She dodged, mumbling about complicated procedures, but no one was convinced anymore. The curtain had been pulled back, exposing the extent of her deception. One by one, neighbors stood up during the open discussion, recounting stories of her overreach, her invented claims of authority, and costly projects never properly approved. The pattern was undeniable. She had been running the whole like a personal kingdom. The final blow came from an elderly neighbor I'd never met. Rebecca tried to fine me for the color of my mailbox last month. When I reminded her I don't live in the HOA, she said property aesthetics were a